to see you all. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's a marvellous group. And I'm very happy, actually, to see one or two faces that knew me in another incarnation when I was a university lecturer. And they'll know that I've got 55 minutes to present, and then I'll take questions. But feel free to intervene if things aren't clear as I go along. I'm hoping that this will be very enjoyable. I'm not terribly wonderful on the technology, but I've got a support team here. So marvellous to see you. Okay, let's see where we are. I'm talking about things that have been stimulated really by the run-up to the American election and the persistence of violence, of racist, sexist violence, and the tremendous impact that it has. And I'm talking about really the origins of the states, where that came from. And I'm dealing with quite serious stuff, so I hope you don't get bored, but to me it feels quite topical, because often here in New Zealand I think we're not very familiar with some of these issues. So I'm going to start in a place we are familiar, which is 1840, when, as we know, in the Bay of Islands, the leaders of Māori and sovereign people were carefully considering signing a treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi, with representatives of the British Empire. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, at the heart of that empire, the great and the good of Victorian society were gathering at the World Anti-Slavery Convention. Its aim was nothing less than the universal abolition of slavery and the slave trade, and the protection of emancipated Negroes in the British colonies. So here we have the convention. They've been invited, the delegates have been invited from anti-slavery societies around the world. This is the biggest picture in the National Portrait Gallery. It takes up a whole wall, and at the time it circulated, and you can still find a guide to all of these great men. So the tone of the convention was somewhat congratulatory, but the delegates did have something to celebrate. Slavery and indentured servitude had been fundamental to the economies of Britain and America. And, sorry, I like to read. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence, British criminals, the last load of them, had been transported to America and sold upon arrival into indentured servitude. 7 years later, in 1783, you're not going to be examining on the dates, you don't have to remember. There's more or less a sequence, it's just to keep me remembering its history. The United States became a new independent country. Remarkably, in the last year of the 18th century, the first government anywhere in the world to pass a law requiring the gradual emancipation of slaves was New York. And in 1827, they became the first democratic government anywhere in the world to outlaw slavery itself. So already we've got a drive in the north towards emancipation. In 1807, the first decade of the 19th century, the British government passed an act to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. And both Britain and the now independent American governments had made the importation of slaves a crime and set up navy squadrons to intercept slave ships in the North Atlantic. And then, in 1833, the interracial Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society was established by Quakers Lucretia Mott and Mary Ann McClintock. Remember those names, you're going to hear them again. They promoted racial and sexual equality. because in the 1830s, America had seen something completely new, the emergence of women organized as a group, engaging publicly in highly political activity. That's a relative of Clarkson, and over here we've got various philanthropists, including Lady Byron. And this is a man called Prescott, and this is supposed to be the tension in the picture. So, but we'll see that. So, in 1833, we had the first Women's Anti-Slavery Convention dedicated to racial and sexual equality, and this is their logo. And it says, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" It invited people, women, to identify. So they'd seen something completely new, which was a group of women organized and engaged in a highly politicized activity. The anti-slavery campaign mobilized women around a public cause in a completely new way. And then, momentously, in the same year, the British slavery was abolished throughout the empire. 5 years later, the British government raised a huge loan to pay out the 44,000 British slaveholders compensation for their capital loss. Bankers Rothschild and Montefiore provided the largest loans to the British government. That debt was paid off in 2015. When British Prime Minister David Cameron raised yet another loan to redeem the British government's perpetual bonds from which he and other elite families had benefited for 177 years. So slavery ended in Britain on terms acceptable to the Tory elite. Some critics have been ill-mannered enough to point out that the taxes of many descendants of slaves in the UK have been used to pay the compensation loan from which many wealthy British families have benefited and continue to do so. So some of this payout money, and it was very large, was invested in the British industrial economy, some in the colonies. South Australia did particularly well, half of Adelaide was built with it. And quite a lot ended up maintaining the grand estates beloved of British romantic costume dramas. Bridgerton is not historically accurate. Nevertheless, it did mean that by 1840, the British Empire was free of slavery. But as the delegates congregated in London, the issue of slavery was raging in the United States. As American abolitionists mobilized this new type of mass movement, they were met with increasingly violent white male mob resistance. As conflict increased, the Constitution of the United States, which had been ratified in 1787, which had been constructed to balance the power of the slave and free states, came under intense pressure. At stake was the question of what was the biggest, newest and shiniest democracy, proclaiming equality for all to be self-evident, to actually mean. So, in 1840, the London Convention, let's go back to the convention. Oh, no, there we are. The London Convention had been set in motion in Britain by the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the African Slave Trade, which was principally a Quaker organisation. It was established in London in 1787, and of its 12 founders, 9 were Quakers and 3 were Tory High Church Anglicans. The Tories took care of the parliamentary manoeuvring around the Act, but as dissenters, Quakers were barred from Parliament public life and the universities, and therefore from the learned professions. They were barred from classical education, but Quakers had been very industrious in the new technologies, such as improving printing. So it was largely the Quakers who pioneered the first modern mass human rights campaign. Let's go forward, see what we can find. Right. Learning from the Unitarian Josiah Wedgwood, that's what we had his there we are, there's Josiah Wedgwood's famous logo. They learned from Josiah Wedgwood's new mass marketing techniques, and aiming to peacefully persuade rather than force opinions, Quakers invented branding, using logos on an inventive range of merchandise and recognisable insignia on various images. So we've got a brooch and we've got a plate, snuff boxes, and you name it, they were all over it. It was really very effective as political merchandising goes. So they had recognising images on posters and pamphlets, along with massive petitions, and they even tramped the streets of London in the first organised mass mail drop. So who were the Quakers who found themselves in the midst of a political storm? The religious society friends, known as Quakers, emerged in the 17th century. The central Quaker belief is the spiritual equality of all people, based on the authority of the individual's personal, direct experience of God's presence. Guided by their inner light, Quakers sought to find and value that of God in every man. And from the beginning, they believed that every man included women and men of all races, bound and free. In 1666, that's the 17th century, Margaret Fell, the female co-founder of Quakers, had published Women Speaking Justified, proved and allowed by the scriptures, asserting women's moral authority and spiritual equality, and therefore their right to a voice in religious practice. 5 years later, George Fox, the male co-founder of the Quakers, whose 400th birthday we're here celebrating this year, implicitly recognised the moral and spiritual capacity of enslaved people when he urged Quakers to educate their slaves and limit their term of enslavement. There was, however, an enduring tension between the radical autonomy of the individual voice and the strict discipline of Quakers' separatist communities, which were structured around local monthly and yearly meetings. Nevertheless, the belief in equality had led the American Quakers to rid their own communities of slavery before the end of the 18th century. They were the earliest and most consistent opponents of human slavery. But by the 19th century, they joined with other groups working for abolition. So, in the 1830s, the female anti-societies of Boston and Philadelphia were organised by Quaker women. They raised a great deal of money, but they also activated a whole new constituency for social and ultimately political reform. They were well organised and effective, but they faced increasingly violent reaction. I'm just going to go forward. We've had that, that's there, okay. Let's see, I'm going the wrong direction. So, what it says down here is from Hebrews. It says, remember they that are bound as bound with them. So they were identifying with the slave. They were demanding sympathy for the slave at a human level. And this logo became very significant. It's very consistently used. So eventually, the tension within Quaker community organisations would split them in 1848 around the extremist strategies, and particularly the issue of women's rights to speak. So all these issues are going to be played out in this convention. So who's there? Well, here we have Henry Stanton from the American Anti-Slavery Society, and there we've got Mott from the Philadelphia he's also a delegate, and we've got various recognizable people, and you can go on the internet and see if your belly is there. So the convention had invited delegates from the anti-slavery societies worldwide. Henry Stanton had travelled with his new wife, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. There he is, and there. And James Mott, one who's, I'm sorry, James Mott, let's see if I can do it, is there. And he had travelled with his wife, Lucretia Mott. So, given the women's public effectiveness, several American societies had seen fit to send women delegates. The American Society delegated 7 women, 3 from Boston, and 4 Quakers, including Lucretia Mott, James Mott's wife, dressed in her usual, very nice Quaker grey. So it was regarded as modest, but they also liked grey because they were opposed to the indigo dyes that were slave produced. So it's part of a boycott, really, as well as a style of plain dress designed not to draw attention to yourself. They did plenty of other things which did draw attention to themselves. So there they were at these delegates. So where were these delegates? Where are they in the picture? The women around the edge over here are almost all benefactors, and that does include Lady Byron there. And that's, as you say, a relative of Clark's. So the convention had spent most of its first day debating whether to recognise the women delegates. The discussion became more personal and bitter with every passing hour. Lucretia Mott was asked to withdraw her delegation, but in her calm manner insisted that the delegates had no discretionary power. The responsibility of accepting the women must rest with the convention itself. After hours of vociferous debate, the men decided that if the women wanted to attend, they could listen to the proceedings from behind a curtain. Somewhere in the back of the gallery, maybe here, somewhere there. That's where they were. And today, of course, it's being called being cancelled. And you can imagine they did not like it. And when William Lloyd Garrison arrived, the leader of the American anti-slavery, he chose to support the women in the gallery, so he isn't in the picture either. When the American women delegates arrived in London, they were not naive. They had experienced racist and sexist mob violence, and it was fresh in their minds. 2 years before the convention in London, the AGM of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society had faced down a violent mob when they left their hall arm in arm and continued their AGM at Maria Chapman's house. The women had faced their most serious attack in 1838. Let's find Pennsylvania Hall. There we are, Pennsylvania Hall. Pennsylvania Hall was dedicated to the rights of free speech because many venues, including some Quaker meeting houses, were closed to abolitionists. Its auditorium held 3,000 people. It was one of the nation's largest and most luxurious meeting places, dedicated to discuss subjects of national policy and philanthropy, including temperance, and debate the wrongs done to Indigenous people and the Convention to End Slavery. The hall opened for the first day of the second anti-slavery convention of American women. The mob threw stones, breaking the windows, but despite repeated efforts to frighten the audience, the women completed their business on the first day. The next day, the women's meeting was again attended by men and women, both African American and Euro American. The hall was surrounded by a dangerous mob. The delegates were obliged to protect our coloured sisters while going out by taking each of them arm in arm. Black cards have been posted all around Philadelphia in the name of respect for property rights and the preservation of the Constitution, and demanding the immediate dispersion of the convention forcibly if necessary. The second day, the women were drowned out by the noise and the catcalls when Maria Chapman rose to speak. Stones came crashing through the windows, and then a group of ruffians burst into the room and ran shouting down the central aisle, bringing the meeting to a halt. So it's nothing new, driving cars into crowds of various things you don't like. But the women came back the next morning, determined to go on. But the crowd outside was larger and more menacing. The office of Pennsylvania Hall called for police protection, and it was denied. The windows were shattered. The office of the hall marched out on the platform and recommended to their sisters not to attend the evening meeting, as the mob seems to direct themselves particularly towards coloured people. And at that, axes and torches broke into the building. The women escaped by a side door, watching the mob of more than 1,000 strong men take over the hall, gathering books and papers from the offices, ripping blinds from the windows. They built a bonfire on the speaker's platform, and to make it burn faster, they twisted the gas jets onto the flames.
Does this remind you of?
Yes, it is.
What does this remind you of?
Yes, what does it remind you of? Yes, so the firemen refused to come, and the hall burned all night. Garrison was smuggled out of Philadelphia in a covered carriage. Next day, the women had been scheduled to hold their final session at Temperance Hall. They marched through the streets 2 by 2. They concluded their business in a little schoolroom with the following resolution: the prejudice against colour is the very spirit of slavery. It is therefore the duty of abolitionists to identify themselves with these oppressed Americans by sitting with them in places of worship, appearing with them on our own streets, by giving them our countenance in steamboats and stages, by visiting them in their homes and encouraging them to visit us, receiving them as we do our fellow citizens. So you can see quite clearly that the women are identifying their own rights and slavery, women's rights, and prejudice come together. So anti-slavery, anti-racism was actually at the centre of the women's cause. But the mob was still roaming the streets, and there was fear that they would attack the Mott's house. They finished their supper, and Lucretia sent clothing and articles to her friend's house and sent the younger children to her friend Maria's. Peace-loving Quakers posted ready for any emergency. She could hear the mob approaching, and then, miraculously, the men seemed to be moving away. Lucretia learnt later that quick-witted friend had joined them, shouting into the mob, "Let's go to the mobs," and leading them away. But before the night was over, the mob had burnt the newly built coloured orphans' house. So they were on the rampage even then. Slavery was closer to home in the United States than it was in London. In America, and I think we need to somehow take that in, that it's really very visible, it's all around you. And so, and as I said, the decade leading up to it, up to the conference, was one of rising tension and violent reaction. So there they were at the somewhere up there in the dark, grizzling, Paul. And in the gallery of the 1840 London Convention, Lucretia Mott met a younger Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they formed a creative friendship which would change our lives. Stanton wrote that by the end of the day, behind the curtain, she and Lucretia had agreed to hold a women's rights convention when they got home to America. Hence, she wrote, work for the emancipation of women in the land of the free and the brave was then and there inaugurated. Many years later, she would write, the movement for women's suffrage in both Britain and America may be dated from the World's Anti-Slavery Convention. So although they'd go on to work assiduously for universal suffrage, and they saw black men enfranchised in 1879 in the 15th Constitutional Amendment, none of these women lived long enough to cast a legal vote. So abolitionist Quaker women mobilised widespread participation in these hotly political humanitarian causes, and they carried many Quakers with them. But they would soon challenge and eventually disrupt Quaker organisation in America. Quaker women such as Abby Kelly Foster and Susan B. Anthony, who had grown up in Quaker homes, had been especially effective in promoting the cause. Quaker women were the best educated of their generation because Quakers cared about the education of their girls as much as their boys. And both of the women I've mentioned were very well educated in Quaker schools. That's the birthplace of Susan B. Anthony. And I put the one before up because I think she's the only woman who ever got her face on a silver dollar. I'm not sure about that, but just to cheer you up that, something did happen in the end. So that's her birthplace. But Susan had been educated in a Quaker boarding school, and Lucretia and James Mott had been educated at the same Quaker boarding school in upstate New York. Abby Kelly Foster at the New England Friends boarding school in Rhode Island. And so all of these women who actually became very effective spokespeople had this exceptionally good education, largely in some single-sex, but mostly co-ed boarding schools. Quaker women had heard women speaking in Quaker meetings. At 21, Mott had been recognised as a gifted speaker. Quaker women and men with a concern to speak could apply for a minute from their meeting, which would allow them to travel widely to other meetings and expect to be heard. Mott travelled very widely, speaking at meetings across the eastern seaboard. I think it's a nice tradition. It's a kind of calling card. I still treasure the travelling card given to Hester and I when we left our Lewis meeting in 1986, returning to New Zealand. So women were speaking in their own meetings, and it was quite accepted. But speaking in mixed-sex or public gatherings was contentious. Quaker abolitionist women were employed by the American Anti-Slavery Society, and they were the first women to be paid as public speakers in America. A number of these women were, however, disciplined by their meetings as the rift began to grow. Abby Kelly Foster, for example, was disowned by her meeting, while Susan B. Anthony's father was disowned for allowing the girls in a school he set up in his house to dance. He continued attending meetings for many years, but he would eventually become a stalwart of the progressive Quakers. So this is in Massachusetts, and later the family moved north. So there was very little outcome from the 1840 convention. While slavery had ended in the British Empire, it was heating up in America and posing more and more difficult questions about what the new republic was going to stand for. It was a decade of extreme tension, and it was often violent. So, where did this come from? I want to go now to what's happening in. Hang on, look at that one. Okay. So this is the black population. This is the white population of the eastern seaboard. Of course, they haven't got any further than the Mississippi. Just after independence in 1790. So white people are here in the north. You can see there's a relative absence of them here in the southern states, Virginia and Carolinas, Delaware, Maryland, there. So already you're beginning to see a difference. And here on this side we've got the black population, and there we've got white in 1860 and black in 1860. So you can see that there's more and more of a differential. As they push west, the issue is growing. We've got this much larger white population, and here we've got black population coming across into Alabama, across to Mississippi, up the Mississippi River, and spreading here. And the numbers are incredibly different. There were in 1790 there were about 500,000 slaves. By the time we get here, there's 4 million. So there's been a massive, massive extension in that period of the black population and of slavery. So the Constitution of the United States was designed to balance the power of the slave and free states. So conflicts about the conditions over which new states entered the Union as the population grew were repeated over and over again under the strain of it, and kept on having these kind of mini civil wars every time a new state sought to be admitted. So and the effect was actually to embed race at the very heart of the new state. It's part of the structure of that new state. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state and created Maine, by chopping off a bit of Massachusetts, as a free state in an attempt to maintain the constitutional equilibrium. But it also, the compromise sharpened the division between North and South because it outlawed slavery north of the Mason-Dixon line, the 37.3 parallel here. This is the Mason-Dixon line, and that was as it was originally set up, and that's as it was extended. So what happened was, as you got expansion, you got conflict about what was happening in the so-called border states. So, and in the end, and for example, it led to more and more conflict. And in the end, in Kansas, it really did lead to an outbreak of armed conflict, when the issue of whether Kansas was going to actually become a slave or a free state, people actually took up arms and started shooting each other. So, and as I said, behind this growing conflict is the growth of population. There was an enormous demand for cotton, not least by the mills of New England and the weavers of Lancashire. And this enormously increased the demand for slave labour in the South. And the only sources since the slave trade had been obliterated were either from illegal trading with non-British colonies or from forced breeding. Historian John Cummings, who's read over 1,000 oral histories of enslaved people, has yet to find one where the women were not raped and the men were almost beaten to death or had their finger cut off or their ear cut off for trying to run away, because human chattel was valuable property. More black babies spent more money for slaveholders who paid for women to go with enslaved men. One woman had had 15 children, none of them by the same father, because she'd been sold on every time she had a baby to a new man. Forced breeding created a surplus of enslaved children by 1860. On the eve of the Civil War, 57% of the Americans' 400 enslaved people were under the age of 20. So you can see why the remember them as bound with them had a certain increasing resonance. Quakers were very heavily engaged in the Underground Railway. Here's a picture of the routes that escapees tried to take to get to the north, despite extremely horrendous punishments. Attempts by slaves to escape never stopped, and the Caribbean saw repeated slave uprising. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 provided even more harsh punishments for anyone assisting escapees. Many Quakers made their homes stations on the Underground Railway. That's Liberty Farm, Abby Kelly's, the home Abby Kelly shared. She had a good gender reversal going on with her husband, who was stay at home, when she went out raising the troops. That was one of the stations on the Underground. It's called Liberty Farm. And so Lucretia Mott and Martha Wright, her sister, who'd grown up in the self-sufficient Quaker community of Nantucket Island, were others. And there were numerous, well, you can see from the map, how dispersed actually how dispersed the routes were. And at that time, they're up here. Of course, it was easier from the seaports, but these routes across the Ohio River, that's the Ohio, here's the Mississippi, there's still a long way to walk. So, numerous stations here were Quaker homes. So Elizabeth Stanton and Lucretia Mott, the two women who plotted the Women's Rights Convention behind the curtain in the gallery of 1840, didn't get together again until 1848. But when they did, the women's rights movement really took off. In the summer of 48, Mott visited her sister Martha Wright in upstate New York. By upstate, I sort of mean the finger area along the shores of Lake Erie, really. While staying with her sister, Lucretia attended the Genesee Yearly Meeting. The Genesee Yearly Meeting covered the whole of lakes up Erie and Ontario, Michigan, Ontario, and up in New York. And at that yearly meeting, 200 friends, influenced by Thomas McClintock, remember that name again, left and formed the Congregational or Progressive Friends. Much earlier, Thomas McClintock had founded the free produce boycott movement with James Mott, and now McClintock aimed to modernise Quaker practice. Both Thomas and his wife Mary Ann supported an equal voice for women within the Society of Friends and opening all meetings to both men and women. This is the McClintock House at Seneca Falls. And you're going to see these tensions beginning to affect the organisation. And Jane Hunt, who lived in this house, invited Mary Ann Clintock and her daughter, and Lucretia Mott and her sister Martha, to tea, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And that by the time that she was invited to meet again, Stanton was living in this house. lots of good pictures now, because when I was sort of doing all this, you had to go and find them. Now they're all national treasures, and there's a national park, the Women's Rights National Park, so you can go on a virtual tour, which is quite fun. So she lived in this house. Stanton, I really like Stanton, I've got a warm spot for her. She had a lawyer's brain, sharp, incisive and frustrated. She should have been a judge like her father, and she resented that she was not. Stanton was independent-minded and very vigorous. On trains, she threw open windows for fresh air. She was not interested in fashion. She liked food and disliked corsets, and had a very large appetite for life. She thought for herself she disliked doctors, and carried her box of homeopathic remedies with her, and was quite confident giving birth to her 7 children on her own. So over tea, she's lining up, isn't she? Over tea, Katie Stanton poured out her frustration at raising her first three of her 7 children, about the lack of opportunities for married women and the impossible expectations placed upon them. She was the only one around the table who was not then a Quaker, although later she joined the Progressive Circle. The women decided then and there to make good their decision made in London in 1840 to call a Women's Rights Convention. They immediately advertised the convention, and they called it to meet in this hall here, which was nearby, which had been built by, partially built by Jane's husband, Jane Hunt's husband. So there they were. They were gathered at the Women's Rights Convention. And they were about to call it. They gathered in this plan, set it up, in this, around this table, in the McClintock's pub. And there they drew up the Declaration of Sentiments for the first Women's Rights Convention. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence in 1776 had listed the grievances justifying the rebellion against King George. Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments for that first Women's Rights Convention listed the grievances that justified women's rebellions against the authority of men, and she did not hold back. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of men towards women, having the direct object of establishing the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. It's word to word from the Declaration of Independence. She just takes them right out and changes what we now call pronouns. So she goes on, having deprived her of the first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, having therefore withheld from her without representation in the halls of legislation, he oppressed her on all sides. He has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. He's taken from her the right of property, even to the wages she earns. In marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming, to all intents and purposes, her master. The law giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and administer chastisement. You can see where the slave analogy is coming in. He has so framed the laws of divorce as to what should be proper, that in case of separation, the guardianship of the children shall be given as to be wholly regardless for the happiness of the women, the law in all cases going upon the false assumption of the supremacy of men and giving all power into his hands. He has monopolised nearly all the profitable employments, and from those she is permitted to follow, she receives but scanty remuneration. He closes against her all the avenues of wealth and distinction. He has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education. He allows her in church as well as state, but a subordinate position. He has created a false public sentiment by giving to the world a different code of morals for men and women, by which moral delinquencies which exclude women from society are not only tolerated, but deemed of little account in a man. And perhaps most eloquently, they concluded, he has endeavoured by every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life, only tolerated, but deemed of little account. So I think it says something that 100 people, including 23 Quakers, signed this declaration. And it was regarded as so successful that it was repeated 2 weeks later in the larger town of Rochester. So they got really underway. And at the Rochester Convention, there was attended by progressive Quaker Daniel Anthony and Mary Ann, his wife, and their younger daughter. They also all signed the declaration. Let's go on, shall we? Oh, that's Phillida Bunkle, who becomes a great supporter of women, one of the key supporters in the 19th century, actually. Here she is again. So we're back to Susan B. Anthony's father. Anthony was a warm, lively, hospitable man, and he'd moved from his house in Adams, Massachusetts, where his older daughter Susan had been born. Daniel had been completely committed, impeccable Quaker in Massachusetts, but as I say, he'd been disowned by his meeting when he allowed the girls in the small school to dance. He continued to attend meeting, but he and his wife's views became increasingly liberal as their involvement in the social justice platform grew, and they'd moved to the same part of upstate New York. Daniel Anthony found much more sympathetic home with the progressive Quakers. Anthony's house became a focus for the liberal people on Sunday afternoons for the discussion of progressive Quaker circles, where they enjoyed warm hospitality and embraced a wide platform of social justice issues. Frederick Douglass, who I just showed you, became a very close personal friend of the Anthony family. It's indicative of the strain that Quaker organizations experienced as the commitment of members to social justice became more prominent. So Anthony had sent his daughter Susan to a Quaker boarding school. She was 26 by the time that she left the Quaker environment, and she was to become perhaps the most prominent famous human rights campaigner in the United States. As I say, I think she's the only one who got a face on the dollar. Susan met Stanton in 1851 through their mutual friend Amelia Bloomer, because they both supported rational dress, at least in principle, hoping to get their skirts out of the mud. Their meeting was the beginning of another lifelong creative relationships. But in some ways, they were chalk and cheese. And this is the desk, where, we'll just keep this in mind. So this was the desk where Stanton, at home with her enormously growing tribe of children, wrote and wrote and wrote the women's rights movement, producing speeches, tracts, arguments and petitions, never missing a logical point in the comprehensive campaign for women's civil rights. Most of the most famous words of women's rights flew from this small desk. Don't know, this was a wonderful story of her coming home from a women's meeting and finding that her older children had got a bit bored and decided to see if the baby would float. So they tied corks around it, and sure enough, luckily it did. And it was deeply amusing. So they were made of stone stuff. Not much childcare in those days. So I'm very fond of her. So I'm just following myself. So while Anthony was single and brave, she travelled and travelled alone around the country, spreading the word of universal suffrage, equal pay, and free public education for girls and boys, black and white. So she stood very, very firmly for universal suffrage. That was her message. She became famous for facing down the howling racist white male mob, but violence was becoming more threatening. And in 1860, she went out to bleed in Kansas, actually, in the 1850s while they were shooting at each other, tried to persuade them to stop. They didn't, but not till they shot lots of each other. But anyway, she became famous for facing down the mob. And in 1861, with the civil rights approaching, the mob shut down all of her meetings in every town from Buffalo to Albany. In 1863, in the middle of the war, Anthony and Stanton mounted the largest petition in the nation's history in favour of the emancipation of slaves. They organised 2,000 petition collectors, and they got 400,000 people, one in every 24 of the northern population, to sign that petition. The Emancipation Declaration followed. But after, I think this death did jolly hard work, don't you? But after the Civil War, Anthony and Stanton tried to revive the women's campaign for universal suffrage. They turned the suffrage organisation into the American Equal Rights Association to campaign for the equal rights of all citizens, and especially the right of suffrage. They were joined by Lucretia Mott and Douglas, and after the Civil War, they tried to revive the campaign. They were joined by Lucretia Mott and Frederick Douglass and other progressive Quakers, long-time champions of anti-slavery, civil rights and the women's cause. But in 1870, the 15th Amendment proposed the enfranchisement of black men only. Stanton and Anthony opposed it, fearing that the explicit inclusion of man into the Constitution and the exclusion of black and white women from the Constitution would set back the women's cause. What happened was, at that point, the women's movement splintered. It turned out women would have to wait another 50 years to vote. None of the pioneers lived long enough to cast a legal vote in a presidential election. But here they are, I quite like it, on a 3-cent stamp, American stamp, much later, celebrating their achievement. Thank you. I don't know if you want to have join us. There's tea and coffee for you here. Oh, no, there's not. There's tea. And you've sandwiches. We can pass them around. But maybe people would like to make some comments or ask some questions first. I don't know. Shall we see if there's anything burning that anyone would like to ask?
Yeah, I'd like so. Elizabeth Fry was the woman that was always in our social studies books. And Elizabeth Fry is the Quaker, the British Quaker. Yes. And I just wonder where she fits in, or if she was just sort of sold to us as a figurehead or quite...
Oh no, I think they pioneered a lot of social justice issues. And Fry was very much involved with prison reform.
Yeah.
And the British Quakers were the first to set up a mental hospital that was in York, the Retreat, that was based on the idea that that insanity was not permanent, that you could recover. And these women were very engaged in similar issues. And they opened the first medical school in Philadelphia just after the Civil War. They were engaged with Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman doctor, and her sister Emily. Elizabeth was the first doctor in Britain and in the United States, and they set up a clinic called the New York Infirmary for Indigenous Women and Children in the 1840s, and that was sponsored by Quakers. They also set up 14 different tertiary institutions, all of them co-ed, to educate their children, some of which, Swarthmore, for example, was named Swarthmore College, then University. So there was a raft of health and education initiatives, which I haven't gone into. So, I think Elizabeth Fry fits absolutely in that, because there's a sense of not just autonomy, but obligation to find God in every man. It's that egalitarian impulse to find and acknowledge the humanity of people, which provides that drive towards this it's a very wide social platform. I've looked at mostly at suffrage, but actually they're all engaged, especially people like Mont. She was at the opening of the first class. I did have a picture actually of it, of men and women in the first undergraduate class sitting together in their robes, and they were honouring her as an initiator. And so that education, if you like, alternative health, and the Blackwell's hospital in New York, she was also one of the founders of the London School of Medicine for Women, and she was a professor of hygiene there. But her approach was very much what we now call social medicine. And the graduates of her school in New York couldn't find anywhere to practice, which was a huge problem for them. They couldn't get into the hospitals to practice. So she sent them down to the Lower East Side to look after the very poor immigrants there and learn from there. And so, and that school, it burnt down at the end of the 19th century, but then there was a great move to co-education, and it got co-educationalized and then vanished, and then the whole, dumping on women doctors happened, and the school that it became stopped having them, and da-di-da. So the platform in the 19th century is very, very broad, and lots of housing initiatives too. Plenty to do. Sandy.
I just wondering about the doctrine of discovery, and how did the Quaker women confront the Pope or the Catholics over that doctrine, which must have been going along hand in hand with their...
I don't think it's something that was very much talked about in the United States, actually. You had that great surge of people that happened when the French were driven out of North America. Catholicism became a very minor part, and actually James Cook, who wasn't then a captain, had a good part in that. He surveyed the St. Lawrence, which allowed the British to drive the Quakers out of Quebec. The French out of Quebec. And once, you see, the French power went down the St. Lawrence, across the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi, and it hemmed in the British colonies. It was only when they'd driven the French out of what were called the French and Indian Wars, the end of that you got the surge of British colonisation pushing across. And they were all very well established on the eastern seaboard. And they got rid of the British. So I don't think that doctrine played much part in the minds of 19th century Americans.
It was written in the Civil War, isn't it?
I don't know, Sandy. I'm not sure. I mean, American law was such a break from British law, by the Constitution, and the structure was so different that I can't actually answer your question.
How were they resourced in the first instance?
Well, the women raised huge amounts of money for the abolition cause, and they had these massive sales of work, and they really did make a lot of money to finance their abolition campaign. And but it's also true that, as I said, Quakers were not allowed to participate in the learned professions because they were kept out of the universities. And it wasn't until the 1871 Universities Tests Act that that prohibition on British universities was removed. So you couldn't go to a British university if you were a dissenter until after 1871. So what happened was they became very effective in the technical trades, and they educated their children for independence, and they were very keen on science and technology. They taught their girls maths, so they were very innovative in manufacturing, in transport, at sea, and most of these people had made quite a lot of money as merchants. The Motts had, so did her father. Her father, she grew up on Nantucket, which is self-sufficient, Quaker community. And her father took his first boat, his first ship, heading for China to trade in the early 19th century, and he vanished. And so her mother set up her own business. She went she turned the parlour into a shop. She went to mainland, she got things you couldn't buy on the island, pins and needles and leaves of ice. 6 years later, he reappeared. And his boat had been impounded in Valparaiso by the Spanish. So, like you do, he walked over the Andes and worked his passage home. So, independence was very much part of it. And actually, if you go to the Nantucket Museum, you'll find quite a lot of Maori artifacts, Pacific Maori artifacts. They were whalers, they were traders. That part of the Finger Lakes up in New York, that's where the Erie Canal goes and transformed the economy. So they're doing pretty well, trading and manufacturing up there. Yeah. Like Susan B. Anthony's father owned a mill, a cotton mill, and it faltered, and that's when she had to leave school and go to work as a teacher. But the Motts had, after the experience, and they became merchants, and they found it they all lived by free produce, so they couldn't sell cotton, and they wandered around in, having been spun or wool or whatever, but they managed to make a lot of money doing it. Yeah. So they tended to form that kind of independent merchant class, and you tended to find Quakers where there was a lot of independent employment, self-employment, and it tended to be in skilled trades. I know about not being able to go to university because my grandfather was wanting to go to Cambridge in maths and couldn't go because he was a dissenter. So he had to become a tradesman. And he became an ironmonger, and he was very unsuited to it. And my mother never got over it, which is why I was forced to into university. So she failed her own university course because she hadn't learned classics at school, because she wasn't allowed to go to the local primary school, which was private, which would have taught her, because her father was a tradesman. So they did better, where in trades, dissenters tended to be heavily involved in the trades, and therefore they were excluded from polite society because they were tradesmen, and so were their children. So they had heaps of drive. Anything else about him? There are unusual lots. Hello.
Oh,
When?
Oh, just that having grown up with the American education system, there's another relevant stream in all of that, and that is that the indigenous people were enslaved. And so you can see it's the black population, and it's likely that when the indigenous people were lumped in because they were enslaved. And my utter ignorance of anything from my own education, formal education, of the role of the indigenous people in any sense, even Thanksgiving, which people like to celebrate in New Zealand, that was the indigenous people
And
saving the lives.
interestingly enough,
Yeah.
that Genesee meeting, that yearly meeting,
Yes.
they were engaged in supporting the local indigenous people against being forcibly removed to the west.
Yes.
And that was one of the issues that whole yearly meeting were very engaged with.
Yes.
And it was one of the issues which the progressive Quakers took with them, that they had been concerned about the dispossession that was going on, because you're quite right, when I mentioned that drive of population across, and that huge drive, that was the Vale of Tears, that was at the expense of the indigenous people. By the time you got to the other side, they'd been completely dispossessed. So you're quite right. And the only meetings, Quaker meetings that I know about, were deeply concerned about that issue in Pennsylvania and in New York.
Well, a lot of what I know now, I've gotten off of documentaries. So superb documentaries that have been on Maori television over the last few years. And virtually everything I've learned for that. I've learned it's been from Maori television.
And you can see this memorialising. I think it's quite useful too, because it does remind us, you know, of many of the issues, and the fact that we've carried them forward with us unresolved. I mean, I think the constitutional issues we've just seen, haven't we? Absolutely played out yet again. So I ended my talk on a high note in 1848 with the beginning of an organised push towards universal suffrage, including black people and women, and I explained how those forces had come together. But at that same year of 1848, the Michigan Yearly Meeting split on the issue of the right to speak on the evils of war, intemperance, slavery, and licentiousness. 3 years before, in 1845, London Yearly Meeting had sent a delegation to the border states to try and prevent a developing schism between the progressive and the established Quakers. But they'd failed to stop the division, and so perhaps I ended on rather too optimistic a note, and I thought I should add a greater understanding of the 2 decades of 1840 and 1850s leading up to the Civil War, because they were periods of deepening division and violence, of mounting threats to peace, and they raised issues that are still very salient for us today, about the inequality, racism, the role of women and men, and particularly of the militia, of private militia, and of the state's role in militarization and, of course, conscription, and the nature. It raised the nature of the legitimate authority and the limits to citizen protest and to alternative action. And so it was very much setting out an agenda for what a democratic state was going to be. And it raises issues, I think, that are really very familiar to us today as we feel ourselves sliding towards more and more dangerous confrontation. So I'm revisiting them. So let's just recap. In 1790, just after independence, the United States was roughly the same size and with the same population as New Zealand today. And the population was clustered around the eastern seaboard. 100 years later, the American frontier was declared closed. So the exploitation of this extraordinarily rich continent was open to exploitation within 100 years. And a huge amount of growing conflict, a movement of people that was quite unprecedented, and growing conflict between enslaved and free labour. So let's just go back to that development. In 1620, the Puritans had landed in Massachusetts. And they'd established a theocracy in the northern states, one of which Quakers were entirely unwelcome with their message of equality, and they were thrown over the border very fast to Rhode Island, into the wilderness, or one was hung, Mary Dyer was hung. So, but they developed a culture in that period, in those 2 centuries, that was very settled. It was largely agricultural, around small settlements that had a high degree of self-governance, actually. They were congregational in their organisation, but quite, we would regard them as highly illiberal, although they did have precedents such as town meetings. So the culture that developed was of seafaring, whaling, trading on the coast, and independent farmers inland, but the conditions were really tough. If we look at the example of the Antonys, who Susan B. Anthony was born in Adams, Massachusetts, it's snowy for 3 months of the year. The soils aren't particularly rich, and so there was a very strong independent drive, and those were the people who spoke up, if you like, for a strong sense of individual, but also of a very controlled community. But the economy began to change a little with the War of Independence. President Jefferson, the second president, embargoed all trade, all foreign trade, and that led to the development of some manufacturing. And for example, the Antonys had a cotton mill that developed in Worcester, Massachusetts, and that was fairly typical of the beginning of industrialization, but nothing like the industrialization in Britain. And so Quakerism tended to be quite strong in those sorts of communities that welcomed individualism and a sense of obligation to a community, but nevertheless had an egalitarian ethos and a strong sense of legitimacy in self-regulation, or self-rule really. And they laid a foundation of democratic expectation for the new state. And as I've said, we've seen the growth of slavery in the South, and these two communities becoming increasingly different in their culture. So what was the next step? If you remember, in the north of New York, where the Seneca Falls was and the progressive Quakers emerged, appeared, and several people asked me about this, quite a well-off community, quite well-established, quite prosperous. It was indeed very prosperous. And what had happened was that in 1825, the Erie Canal had opened, and this connected upper New York State, the upper Hudson, through to the Great Lakes. It was an extraordinary achievement, and it transformed the economic base of America. If you look at the map, you'll see that it gave water access, which is a very good way of moving bulky cargoes. From New York City, you could take a steamer straight up to the north of New York. You could access all the steamer traffic on the Great Lakes, holiday traffic, away from the heat, but also commercially very successful. And if you look at that, there was a real prosperity around that canal, because what it did was actually open the biggest breadbasket in the world. It opened by water access the Midwest, extraordinarily fertile area of the Mississippi Basin. And if you're European oriented, you think of the great breadbasket as Europe, of being Poland or the Ukraine, and they're of course competitors for apples and dairying and wheat growing, but they're nothing compared to the enormous fertility and potential of the Midwest and the agricultural states. This is why the agricultural states have such a large clout in the Senate, for example. So you've got enormous, not only increase in population, but economic growth. And the area I showed you around Seneca Falls was part of that prosperity. And that area, Upper New York, Ontario, both Ontario and Erie, Lakes Erie, and the whole of Michigan were part of the Genesee yearly meeting. And they tended to pioneer these rather more liberal views. So these economic developments redrew the map, really, and opened up this extraordinarily richly endowed continent. And if you go back to the Antonys again, when their cotton mill failed in Massachusetts, they moved up to this prosperous area of Upper New York, where the very rapid growth was taking place. And it was in that environment that you saw a flowering of, if you like, liberal opinion and independence, and a challenge to Quaker orthodoxy. But if we think a little bit more, what was happening in the West as the population pushed west? And as it goes into Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, Kentucky, in the end to Kansas, what happened was that these were border states. They're called the border states, and they're the upper South, along with Kentucky and Tennessee, for example. And the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers really formed a natural boundary, if you like, to the easy influence of the South and the North. They were, and if you were a fugitive, you had to cross either the Mississippi or the Ohio. One of the meetings, Quaker meetings on the borders of the Ohio River, described themselves as a hellhole for slave catchers. They never had a slave recaptured on their territory. And we need to remind ourselves of the real risks of illegal action. So this was illegal. And recently I saw a very good film on Netflix of Harriet Tubman, who was a leading black abolitionist. And she'd been sheltered by a Quaker family in New York for 8 years in New York, waiting for the anti-slavery legislation to pass in New York. They knew it was coming. They were waiting for it to be achieved. And over her lifetime, she made 13 trips to the South, rescuing slaves. But everybody involved took a really significant degree of risk. And the Quakers particularly had a sense of obligation to freed people. They weren't just freed and left. If you freed your slaves, as the Quakers had done, you had to take responsibility for their well-being, their education, clothing, and so forth. So there was a concern about what emancipation would lead to. So you've got this, if you like, seething along the border states, and tremendous conflict about what happened. And 5 of the slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia only became a state in the middle of the Civil War, 1863, but Maryland and Delaware remained slave states, but joined the Union. And so you can see how fraught it was. It wasn't just North and South, slave and free. This was an ongoing, moral, divisive, powerful issue about what was going to happen. And I said in the talk that Kansas, there was actual open warfare, and it became a free state and entered the Union as a free state. But those other ones, along the Mississippi and the Ohio, were, if you like, questionable. And indeed, Missouri and Kentucky, leading up to the Civil War, had 2 governments, one pro-slavery, one against, competing for dominance. So you can see that conflict was profound, and it raised really serious issues around civil rights and personhood. So the issues were like persuasion. The Quakers had tried persuasion. What about force? Some argued that persuasion had failed, and now slavery could only be removed by force. There was the issue of militia and the right to bear arms, about the limits of protest, whether you could act illegally or whether you had to stay within the law of the Fugitive Slave Law, for example. And the growing issues of racism becoming very inflamed, if you like, necessarily, because slavery really only had developed as powerfully as it did because there was a possibility of visually determining who was slave and who was free. It made emancipation enormously more difficult from if you were dealing with indentured servants who were white and their white masters who had bought them. That ability, if you like, to distinguish the person who was likely to be a slave is very powerful in this whole mix. So one of the issues that became more and more as war became nearer was the issue of conscription. Now, Quakers are known for being conscientious objectors, and a very powerful committee of Quakers went to President Lincoln and argued that Quakers should be recognised as conscientious objectors. They should not be conscripted. And this again was dividing communities, not just Quaker communities, but communities across the North. Did you join the Union Army? What for? What the goals were, and so on. And Lincoln said no, Quakers would be conscripted, but they would have non-combatant roles. Again, and relief organisations were set up to support them, and so forth. So conflict became very real and very divisive. And I think, rather like us watching the TV in the Middle East, you feel compelled to come up with some judgment. When when should you fight? When is it legitimate? How should you treat a minority population, and so forth? They're very real issues, and of course around Zionism, around race as well, although perhaps less obviously distinct. So I think these are very real tensions, and it's out of that that the schism in Quakers as orthodoxy with a social justice agenda. They certainly had a social justice agenda. It had been there from the beginning. But how you implement a social justice agenda became highly divisive. And in that sense, I don't think Quakers were unique. I don't think they're unique today. But what they did have was some very clear choices and a sense of needing to articulate those choices, to communicate about them, to organise around them, and to think deeply about what it means to be a citizen in a democratic country. So I leave it there, that we face very difficult decisions now. Our identity is being challenged daily on the news, and how we make those decisions between individual and community, our particular community, our wider community, and the obligation that we have to others who may be very different from ourselves has become very pressing. And we have a sense, I think, that characterised the 1840s and 50s of life being quite precarious. And we're faced with enormous economic changes that are happening very readily around resources, around trade, around fairness, around sharing, and around equality. So I just wanted to end my talk with optimism on the one hand, but a sense of realism and the seriousness of these situations, and to articulate the issues that we all face about really where we're to put our loyalties.